Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from America's hidden past. Today, we uncover a dark chapter. From 1861, Louisiana, a story of grief, vengeance, and a wet nurse who turned the very milk she fed into a tool of retribution. This is the story of 1861 Louisiana Horror, the wet nurse who delivered revenge. Through her milk. The summer of 1861 in Louisiana was a sweltering, suffocating heat that seemed to seep into every corner of the town. The air was thick with the smell of the river, the mud, and the sweat of people working tirelessly under the relentless sun. Families moved quietly behind the doors of grand plantation homes, their lives marked by the rhythms of wealth, power, and cruelty. Yet beneath the polished floors and the bright chandeliers, there were shadow stories that no one dared to speak aloud, whispers that traveled like ghosts through the sprawling corridors. In the heart of one such plantation, a woman named Eliza worked quietly, almost invisibly. She was a wet nurse, a position both necessary and intimate in the world of the Southern elite. Her job was to feed and care for the infant children of the white families, her body a vessel through which life and nourishment were meant to flow. But Eliza carried with her a secret, a fire that no chains, no demands, and no oppression could ever quench. She had lost her own child years before, taken cruelly by circumstances that left her broken and hollow, and in the veins of her sorrow ran a dark resolve. The milk she produced, something that was supposed to sustain innocence, became her tool of subtle vengeance. The plantation where she worked was one of the largest in the region, a sprawling estate of whitewashed walls, ornate balconies, and endless fields of sugarcane swaying like a golden sea. Its owners were wealthy, arrogant, and careless with human life. They prided themselves on their refinement, their sense of superiority, and the belief that they could bend every soul on their property to their will. But they underestimated the quiet intelligence, the simmering rage, and the unyielding will of someone they considered merely a servant. Eliza observed everything. She knew the routines, the secrets, and the fears that no one else dared to speak of. Each day, she moved between the nursery and the kitchens, carrying her burden of milk and unspoken wrath. Her eyes, dark and steady, seemed always to be watching, always calculating. No one could have guessed the thoughts that coursed through her mind, the plans that were forming like shadows at the edge of the candlelight. She had learned to speak softly, smile gently, and submit without question, yet submission was a mask, a tool. Beneath it was a mind that would not forgive, a heart that had been broken and hardened into iron. The children she fed were bright and fragile, swaddled in white linens and dressed with care. The owners doted on them, oblivious to the danger that had quietly entered their nursery. Each feeding was a moment of intimacy, a silent communion that bound mother to child. But Eliza knew that this bond could be twisted. She carried not only nourishment, but also the bitter taste of revenge. She whispered silent prayers for justice. In the quiet hours of the night, each sip she gave infused with her unspoken wrath. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. The children would cry more than usual, the youngest showing signs of discomfort that the doctors could not explain. But the masters were too arrogant, too confident in their world of privilege, to suspect that harm could come from someone so ordinary, so seemingly harmless. Eliza moved with careful precision, timing each act to ensure that suspicion would never fall on her. Her cruelty was quiet, hidden beneath the veil of obedience. But the results were undeniable. A fever here, a persistent cough there, small. Tragedies that no one connected at first, until the pattern began to emerge. The household itself became tense. Whispered conversations between the servants and the family began to carry a note of fear and confusion. The owners could not reconcile the sudden fragility of their children with their previous robust health. Doctors were called, remedies were administered, but nothing seemed to cure the persistent illnesses. Panic, though hidden, crept into the grand halls. The women of the house began to look at Eliza with suspicion, tinged with fear, unable to articulate why her presence seemed both comforting and threatening at the same time. Eliza, however, remained outwardly calm. She moved through the days like a ghost, her eyes watching and recording every word, every gesture. The plantation was full of secrets, of betrayals and cruelties that had long gone unnoticed, but Eliza had learned to see them all. Her own suffering had sharpened her senses, and she had discovered that patience, above all, was the key to vengeance. Revenge was not a fire to be unleashed recklessly. It was a slow, simmering storm, gathering strength until it could no longer. Be contained Dot, and as the summer deepened, bringing with it the scent of wildflowers, decaying leaves, and the heat of the southern sun, Eliza's plan began to take shape. She knew the rhythms of the household as well as she knew the pulse of her own heart. She understood when the masters were at ease, when they were distracted by their affairs, and when the children were most vulnerable. Each action was calculated, each moment timed to perfection. The milk she fed to the children became the silent instrument of her vengeance, a means of reclaiming power in a world that had stripped her of everything. But vengeance, as history often shows, is never simple. It carries with it a weight, a darkness that touches not only the guilty, but also the innocent. Eliza's path was one that would test her own limits, her own morality, and the very essence of her humanity. She moved forward with a determination that was terrifying in its clarity. Each day she walked the line between life and death, between innocence and corruption, knowing that one misstep could destroy everything she had planned out as the plantation basked in its grand illusion of control. And luxury, a storm of a different kind, was quietly gathering. It was a storm born not of nature, but of human fury, a storm that would expose the fragility of power, the vulnerability of those who believed themselves untouchable, and the quiet, relentless force of a woman scorned. The summer of 1861 would be remembered not only for the heat and the long days, but for the dark history that unfolded in the nursery of one Louisiana plantation, a history of milk, vengeance, and the haunting cost of revenge. As the weeks passed, the tension on the plantation thickened like the summer air, heavy and suffocating. Eliza moved through the house with an almost eerie calm, her presence both indispensable and disquieting. The nursery had become a place where life and danger intertwined, where every feeding, every gentle lullaby carried a hidden weight. The children, innocent and unaware, clung to her as though drawn by some invisible thread, trusting the woman who nurtured them. Even as she carried the seeds of their suffering, the family itself was beginning to fracture under the unseen strain. The mistress, a woman used to control and unquestioned authority, had begun to show signs of unease. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flickered nervously toward the nursery. Searching for explanations she could not find, she would often stand at the doorway, hands clutching the folds of her dress, staring at her children with a mixture of love and dread. Her husband, a man of pride and stubbornness, dismissed the warnings initially, insisting that the illnesses were minor, natural, perhaps even exaggerated. But even he could not ignore the relentless succession of fevers, fits of coughing, and sudden bouts of weakness that seemed to strike the youngest members of the household with increasing frequency. Eliza understood that suspicion, if it arose too soon, could destroy everything. She was careful, patient beyond measure, never allowing herself to be observed during the critical moments. She spoke softly when addressed, always calm and composed, her eyes reflecting nothing but serene diligence. The other servants began to notice her quiet confidence. the way she seemed to glide through the house without leaving a trace. Some whispered behind her back, speculating about her motives, yet none dared confront her directly. They had long learned that appearances were deceiving, that the quietest among them often wielded the greatest power. In the nursery, the rhythm of her work had shifted imperceptibly. Feedings were still gentle, still filled with the outward appearance of care, yet the subtle influence she exerted was profound. Each child's cry, each moment of discomfort, seemed to follow a pattern that only she could orchestrate. She had studied them, observed the minutest reactions, learned to predict which child would be affected at what time. It was a cruel ballet, one performed with meticulous precision. Every fever, every restless night was a step in her silent symphony of revenge. Outside, the plantation thronged with life as usual. The fields of sugarcane swayed under the relentless sun. The laborers toiled without pause, and the world beyond the estate remained blissfully unaware of the dark currents swirling within its walls. Yet inside, a subtle panic was growing, like a shadow creeping along the floorboards. The mistress began to seek remedies from traveling doctors, consulting old books of folk cures and remedies brought from Europe. None could explain the cause of the persistent illnesses. None could trace the source of the subtle poison that had infiltrated their lives. And the family, so accustomed to control, was starting to feel the first cracks of vulnerability. Eliza, however, remained untouched by their fear. She had built a fortress of composure around herself, a mask so convincing that even the most attentive observers could not penetrate it. She had learned to listen, to understand the rhythms of the household, and to anticipate the reactions of every adult who walked those grand halls. She knew which words would provoke alarm, and which would be dismissed, which gestures would betray suspicion, and which would lull them into false security. Her intelligence, honed by years of oppression and loss, was now a weapon, sharper than any blade, more precise than any threat. At night, when the house grew quiet and the children slept in their cradles, Eliza would walk alone through the hallways, her steps silent against the polished wooden floors. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls, shadows that mirrored the turmoil simmering within her. She did not move out of malice for its own sake, but out of a deep, simmering desire for justice, for retribution against a world that had taken everything from her. Her sorrow, once crushing, had been transformed into a careful, calculated fury, and she wielded it with deliberate control. The events began to escalate subtly. One child would wake in the middle of the night with chills, another with a sudden cough that rattled in the chest. The parents, frantic and desperate, could not connect the dots. They questioned the other servants, scoured the house for causes, and even began to suspect that some unseen illness had entered their household. But suspicion never fell directly on Eliza. Her timing, her careful management of appearances, ensured that she remained above reproach. She smiled and soothed, whispered reassurances, and in her presence, the family felt an odd sense of calm, even as their children grew weaker. Word began to spread in the surrounding town of the mysterious illnesses at the plantation, though few dared speak openly. Rumors whispered through the taverns and markets, tales of children falling ill without cause, of doctors unable to explain the sudden decline in health. Yet no one could pinpoint a cause, no one could prove the hand behind. And misfortune. It was as though the house itself had been cursed, a place where beauty and wealth masked a creeping, invisible horror. Eliza's resolve was tested in unexpected ways. There were moments when the children smiled at her, moments when their innocent laughter broke through the darkness that filled the household. She felt pangs of guilt, fleeting and sharp, yet they were quickly suppressed by the memories of her own loss and the injustice that had shaped her life. Each act of revenge was a small triumph, a reclamation of power in a world that had denied her humanity. A balance between nurture and vengeance became a delicate dance, one she executed with unerring precision. As autumn approached, the plantation was a place of quiet terror. The children were pallid, their once rosy cheeks now dimmed with illness, and the parents were increasingly desperate for solutions. The doctors, baffled and frustrated, had begun to suggest that perhaps stress or unknown infections were at play. Yet the truth was far simpler, far darker. Eliza's carefully orchestrated plan was unfolding exactly as she had intended, each day bringing her closer to the moment when the consequences of her vengeance would be fully realized. But even as her plot progressed, dangers lurked. One careless glance, one misstep, could unravel months of careful preparation. She knew the risk of discovery, understood the consequences of failure, yet her resolve never wavered. Each night, as she lay down to rest, she rehearsed the plan. In her mind, calculating every possible outcome, anticipating every reaction. Her life, her suffering, and her anger were all invested in this one act, a testament to the human capacity for endurance and the lengths one can go when driven by profound grief and fury. And so the plantation lived in uneasy silence, the grand facade masking the horror within. The wealthy family, blinded by their privilege and arrogance, could not see the threat that dwelled in their midst. They had underestimated a woman they considered powerless, a woman whose grief had transformed into a slow, methodical, and terrifying force. The stage was set for the culmination of her revenge, a reckoning that would leave an indelible mark on the history of the house, and on the memory all who had witnessed it, whether they realized it or not. The first chill of autumn crept into the Louisiana nights, winding through the trees and the open shutters of the plantation. The days had begun to shorten, yet the oppressive weight within the house remained unrelenting. Eliza moved through the hallways with the quiet precision of someone who had become one with the shadows. Each step, each action was measured, deliberate, a part of a plan that had been brewing for months, a plan rooted in grief, fury, and the desire for justice in a world that had denied her every measure of humanity. By now, the family had become a portrait of unease. The mother no longer smiled with ease, her once steady hands now trembling as she attempted to dress the children or serve meals. The father, a man whose pride had always been his shield, found himself growing irritable and anxious, snapping at servants over trifles, searching desperately for explanations that would allow him to feel control over his life once more. The children were frail, their innocence fading with each passing day. Their cries had shifted from the simple complaints of infancy to a deeper, more haunting sound, one that carried the echo of suffering and confusion, a sound that seemed to penetrate even the thickest walls of wealth and privilege. Eliza watched all of this with a steady, calm gaze. She had not grown cold, but she had learned the discipline necessary to survive and to strike back at those who had wronged her. Each child she fed, each interaction she managed, was a thread in a web she had woven meticulously. The household had begun to whisper about her quiet murmurs among the servants, cautious conversations in hushed tones, but no one dared accuse her outright. To do so would have been to step into the eye of a storm, one whose presence they could feel but could not see. It was during these weeks that she began to refine her methods, learning which children were most sensitive to subtle changes, which ailments would go unnoticed by even the most attentive eyes, and how the natural rhythms of the household could be manipulated to ensure the greatest impact. She became a student of observation, of human reaction, of the fragile balance between health and decline. It was a cruel education, but one she mastered with frightening efficiency. Each day, she moved with a purpose that seemed invisible to everyone else, yet left an unmistakable trail of consequence in its wake. The family's desperation grew, and with it, their fear. They brought in physicians from neighboring towns, Men who had seen illnesses, but never a sequence so strange, so unexplainable. They could find no source of the children's suffering. They could prescribe remedies that seemed to alleviate symptoms. Temporarily, only for the next crisis to appear almost immediately after. The parents' confidence, once unshakable, had begun to erode, replaced by a gnawing terror that perhaps they were powerless in the face of forces they could not understand. Eliza, meanwhile, remained unflinching. She did not celebrate the suffering, for she was no sadist. Rather, she understood it as a reclamation of balance. In a world that had stripped her of her child, of her freedom, and of her dignity, she had found a quiet, calculated way to reclaim power. Her actions were a message, one that needed no words, that the powerless could still strike, that grief could transform into action, and that no person, no matter how wealthy or influential, could escape the consequences of their cruelty entirely. The atmosphere within the house became almost unbearable. The staff moved with tension, each footstep on the polished floors sounding louder in the silence of dread. Conversations were cautious, often cut short by the fear of being overheard or misunderstood. The children's illnesses continued to escalate, high fevers that left them listless, coughing fits that rattled through the night, and sudden bouts of weakness that left the parents clutching their little ones in panic. Doctors scratched their heads, the clergy murmured prayers, and the once proud family began to feel as though their world was unraveling in ways that could not be controlled. It was in these moments that Eliza's brilliance became most apparent. She had learned the art of subtlety, the power of invisibility, and the skill of manipulating circumstance without leaving a trace. Each child's suffering was carefully timed, each reaction anticipated, each intervention measured. She was not reckless, for she understood that one misstep could ruin everything. And yet, despite the danger, her resolve never faltered. She had been wronged, and she was determined that the injustice would not stand unchallenged. By mid-autumn, the plantation was a place of tension, so thick it seemed to press against the walls. The owners could no longer ignore the pattern, yet they could not identify the source. Rumors among the servants hinted at darker possibilities, of curses or malicious spirits, but such thoughts were quickly dismissed in polite company. The truth, however, was far simpler, far more terrifying. One woman's grief and rage had quietly infiltrated every corner of the household, shaping the lives of its most innocent residents in ways that no outsider could have anticipated. Eliza's presence in the nursery had become almost ritualistic. She understood every child's needs, every parent's anxieties, every doctor's interventions. Her eyes were always observing, always calculating, and always planning the next step in a sequence of events that would culminate in a reckoning, unlike any the household had experienced before. Each night, she would sit alone by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the fields, feeling a sense of calm that came from knowing that her plan was unfolding exactly as she intended. And then, one night, an unexpected event threatened to disrupt everything. The youngest child, a fragile infant with bright eyes and delicate features, fell into a sudden, convulsive fever that no remedy could calm. The household was thrown into chaos, the parents frantic, the staff panicked, and the doctor scrambling. It was a moment of crisis that could have exposed her, that could have shattered the careful control she had maintained. But Eliza remained composed, moving with precision, her mind calculating every response, every action. In the face of disaster, she found clarity, understanding that the true measure of her power lay not in creating suffering, but in controlling it. In that night of terror, as the fever raged and the household teetered on the brink of panic, Eliza realized the full weight of her actions. The path she had chosen was not without consequence. It demanded patience, intelligence, and courage beyond measure. Each child's suffering was a testament to her determination, but it also served as a mirror, reflecting the depth of her own grief and the intensity of her need for justice. She understood that revenge, once set in motion, could never be fully contained. It had a life of its own, a force that touched everyone in its path. As dawn broke over the plantation, the fever subsided just enough to allow for a fragile calm. The family, exhausted and shaken, could not comprehend the events of the night, attributing the crisis to chance or divine intervention. But Eliza knew the truth, and in that knowledge, she found a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. Her plan was succeeding, but the cost was heavy, a burden she carried quietly within her heart. The nursery, once a place of innocence and comfort, had become the center of a silent war, a battlefield where grief and vengeance collided in ways that no one else could see. As autumn deepened into early winter, the plantation had become a place of quiet dread. Shadows seemed longer, the walls heavier, and even the grand halls that once echoed with laughter now whispered only tension and fear. Eliza moved through it all with the calm of a storm that has been brewing for months, silent, inevitable, and devastatingly precise. The children's illnesses, once mysterious, had become a consistent pattern that no one could explain. Doctors had tried remedies, prayers had been offered, but nothing could undo the carefully orchestrated suffering that had taken root within the nursery. The family was unraveling. The mistress had begun to show signs of hysteria, pacing the floors at night, wringing her hands in despair, and clutching her remaining healthy child as if for protection against a force she could not see. The father, stubborn to the end, had started to question the loyalty of his staff, demanding explanations and answers that could not be provided. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. Tempers flared, and the household, once a picture of Southern wealth and composure, had become a tense, fragile cage where fear ruled every corner. Eliza, for her part, was calm. She had become the silent eye at the center of the storm, untouched by panic or chaos, her mind always calculating, always one step ahead. Her actions were no longer impulsive. They were deliberate, each feeding, each lullaby, each gentle touch a precise instrument of fight. Her revenge. She had taken what was hers by right, the power denied to her by a world that had taken her child, her freedom and her dignity, and wielded it with a quiet, terrifying mastery. But the final act was approaching. Eliza understood that vengeance, to be complete, needed resolution. The family's arrogance, their blindness to the humanity around them, had created the perfect storm. They had believed themselves untouchable, insulated by wealth, by status, by their illusions of control. They had failed to see that the quietest, humblest among them could harbor a force more powerful than any weapon, more precise than any threat. And now, the moment had come when the consequences of their neglect, their cruelty, and their arrogance would be fully realized. It began with the youngest child, the one who had been the healthiest of all. One morning, as the household gathered for breakfast, the infant suddenly became lethargic, unresponsive to touch, eyes glassy and distant. Panic erupted. The parents called for the doctor in haste, voices trembling, faces pale with fear. The staff scurried, fearful that something had gone terribly wrong, and for the first time, the quiet control that Eliza had maintained felt fragile in the face of such immediate crisis. Yet she remained composed, moving with deliberate care, her presence both soothing and unknowingly menacing. The doctors arrived, working frantically to stabilize the child, yet their efforts were met with limited success. The symptoms were unusual, inconsistent with any known illness, leaving the men scratching their heads in disbelief. The family's frustration turned to desperation, and in the chaos, suspicion began to take root. Eyes that had once dismissed, Eliza now lingered upon her with subtle doubt. She maintained her calm, though, never giving them the satisfaction of a reaction, never revealing even a flicker of emotion that could betray her involvement. It was in these moments that Eliza's true mastery became clear. She had prepared for this crescendo, understood the dangers, and calculated every possible outcome. Her revenge was not about indiscriminate harm, but about teaching a lesson showing the family that power, wealth, and arrogance were fragile constructs, vulnerable to the determination of those who had been wronged. And as the day stretched on, as the fevered child was tended to, and the household wrestled with confusion and fear, a sense of inevitability settled over everyone. Something had changed irreversibly. The illusions of control that had once insulated the family were gone, replaced by a quiet, bone-deep terror. The parents, once proud and commanding, now looked at Eliza with a mix of fear and awe, sensing the depth of her resolve, even without fully understanding it. The children, still fragile and trembling, had become symbols of the cost of neglect and cruelty, and the household itself had become a testament to the consequences of underestimating those they considered powerless. Eliza's vengeance was complete not in the sense of violence, but in the profound, undeniable shift of power. She had reclaimed agency in a world that had long denied it, leaving behind a legacy that would haunt the plantation for years to come. In the following days, the household attempted to regain a semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The subtle fractures that Eliza had set in motion could not be repaired. Trust had been broken, authority questioned, and fear had settled into every corner of the estate. The staff moved with caution, the parents lived in constant vigilance, and the children bore the lingering traces of the months of suffering that had unfolded under their watch. The plantation, once a symbol of unassailable wealth and privilege, had been forever altered by a quiet, relentless force that no one had seen coming. Eliza, meanwhile, withdrew into herself. She continued to care for the children, to move through the house with her practiced calm, yet there was a new weight in her steps, a quiet acknowledgment of what had been accomplished and what had been lost in the process. Revenge, she realized, was not a simple matter of right and wrong. It was a complex, consuming force that left marks on everyone it touched. Her grief, her fury, and her determination had reshaped the lives of those around her, and in doing so, she had carved a space for herself in a world that had long ignored her humanity. The plantation remained standing, its walls as grand and imposing as ever, yet the history of those walls had changed. Within them lived the memory of a woman who had wielded grief as a weapon, sorrow as a shield, and determination as a sword. The story of the wet nurse who delivered revenge through her milk became a whispered tale, one told cautiously among servants, repeated in hushed tones in neighboring towns, a dark reminder of the consequences of underestimating the powerless. And so, the house settled into a tense, fragile peace. The family, scarred by fear and humbled by their experiences, never again moved through their lives with the same arrogance. The children, resilient in their own ways, carried the mark of suffering and survival, and Eliza remained a quiet, formidable presence, a living testament to the power of intelligence, patience, and the indomitable will of a woman who had been wronged. History would remember the summer and autumn of 1861 in Louisiana, not only for the events of the Civil War or the daily rhythms of plantation life, but for the dark, haunting story of the wet nurse whose grief transformed into a calculated, unforgettable force. Her story, whispered in shadowed corners and recorded in fragmented memory, became a reminder that justice can take many forms, and that even the most invisible among us can leave an indelible mark on the world. And in the quiet of the nursery, where once innocence had been unquestioned and trust given freely, there lingered the echo of a lesson learned too late, that the human spirit, even when bound by suffering and loss, possesses a strength that can alter destinies, reshape lives, and forever change the course of history.